The thing about humans, and this is something the rest of the galaxy has learned the hard way, is that they will bond with absolutely anything. Rocks, plants, malfunctioning cleaning drones that beep in a pattern they find endearing. Give a human enough time, and they will name it, nurture it, and threaten violence on anyone who tries to take it away. This is the story of how 3 apex predator cubs stole a pillow and accidentally adopted a human. Or maybe it's the story of how a human accidentally adopted them. Honestly, by the end of it, nobody was entirely sure who adopted whom, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Outpost Meridian 12 sat on the frozen surface of Proxima Kepler 6, a moon so cold that exposed skin would crystallize in under 90 seconds. It was not, by any reasonable standard, a pleasant place to live. The wind howled constantly. The sun, such as it was, provided about as much warmth as a distant memory. And the base itself was a sprawling complex of interconnected domes and tunnels that always smelled faintly of recycled air and regret. But it served a purpose. Meridian 12 was a joint species research station, one of a dozen scattered across the outer territories where humans and Corex worked side by side in what the diplomatic corps optimistically called cooperative scientific partnership. What it actually was, of course, was 2 species who had nearly annihilated each other in a brutal 6-year conflict, now awkwardly sharing laboratory space and trying very hard not to make direct eye contact in the corridors. The Corex were, to put it mildly, terrifying. 8 feet tall on average, covered in iridescent black fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, with eyes that glowed amber in low-light conditions and mouths full of teeth designed by evolution for one purpose and one purpose only: killing things efficiently. They moved like shadows given physical form, silent and fluid, and their claws could punch through standard combat armor like it was wet paper. During the war, human soldiers had called them nightmares. The Corex had called humans the Screaming Ones, which was less poetic but arguably more accurate. Peace had come eventually, as it always does, born not from understanding, but from mutual exhaustion. Both sides had lost too much to keep fighting, so they signed treaties, established joint outposts, and pretended very hard that they weren't still deeply unsettled by each other's existence. Lieutenant Hollis had been stationed on Meridian 12 for 11 months, and in that time she had earned a reputation that confused everyone. She didn't flinch. When Corex warriors passed her in the corridors, all 8 feet, and glowing eyes and barely contained predatory energy, Hollis just nodded politely and kept walking. When a young Corex male had accidentally cornered her in a supply closet during a base-wide drill, she had simply said, "Excuse me, you're blocking the gauze," and waited, patiently until he moved. The Corex didn't know what to make of her. Humans were supposed to smell like fear when they encountered apex predators. It was biological, involuntary, and deeply satisfying to Corex instincts. But Hollis smelled like nothing. Antiseptic, mostly. And coffee. It was unnerving. "She's broken," one of the younger warriors had muttered to his packmate after Hollis had walked past them without so much as an elevated heart rate. "Something is wrong with her brain." "She's a combat medic," his packmate had replied, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. Hollis had spent 4 years on the front lines during the war, patching together soldiers, human and eventually Corex, once the prisoner exchange agreements were signed, while artillery fire shook the ground and death screamed overhead. She had held intestines in her hands. She had made eye contact with dying enemies and saved them anyway. She had seen things that would break most people, and somewhere along the way, her fear response had simply worn out. She wasn't brave. Bravery implied the presence of fear overcome. Hollis just didn't have enough left to spare. She was in the medical bay, restocking supplies and very much not thinking about anything in particular, when High Commander Morvak found her. The door hissed open, and suddenly the room felt smaller. Morvak was large, even by Korix standards, a mountain of black fur and coiled muscle, with a scar running down the left side of his face that pulled his lip into a permanent slight snarl. He was the highest-ranking Korix on Meridian 12, a decorated warrior who had personally killed more humans during the war than Hollis wanted to think about. He was also, at this particular moment, standing in her doorway, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Lieutenant," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Hollis didn't look up from her inventory tablet. "Commander? Bleeding or not bleeding?" "I am not injured." "Then you're in the wrong place. Medical Bay is for medical issues. Command Center is down the hall, third left." She heard him exhale, a sound that might have been frustration or might have been amusement. With Korix, it was hard to tell. "I am not here for myself." That made her look up. Morvak stood rigidly, his clawed hands clasped behind his back, in a posture she recognized from her time treating Korix prisoners. It was a stance of forced control, used when emotions threatened to overwhelm discipline. Something was wrong. "Okay," Hollis said slowly, setting down the tablet. "What do you need?" Morvak was silent for a long moment. His amber eyes flickered to the door, then back to her face, and Hollis realized with a start that she was seeing something she had never expected to see on a Korix High Commander. Desperation! "My cubs," he said finally. "They are dying." The story came out in fragments, each word pulled from Morvak like a tooth extraction. His mate, a female named Ida Orveth, had given birth to 3 cubs 8 weeks ago. It had been a difficult pregnancy, unusual for Korix, and she had been weakened by the end of it. But she had survived. The cubs were healthy. For a brief moment, everything had been fine. Then the supply convoy ambush had happened. Orveth had been on that convoy. She had volunteered to escort it personally, despite Morvak's objections, because Korix did not hide behind their mates. She had fought. She had killed many of the raiders before they brought her down. She had died 2 weeks ago, alone in the frozen dark, while her cubs waited in the nursery for a mother who would never return. "They do not understand," Morvak said, and his voice cracked on the word in a way that made Hollis's chest tighten. "They are too young to understand. They only know that she is gone, and they are refusing." "Refusing what?" "Everything. Food, water, contact. The caretakers approach, and they retreat. They bite. They will not bond." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Dr. Prynne says they will die within the week if nothing changes. They are giving up." Hollis absorbed this in silence. She knew about Korix bonding, had read the xenobiology reports during the war. Korix cubs imprinted on their mothers in the first months of life, forming psychological connections so intense that separation could cause actual neurological damage. Without that bond, without that anchor, the cubs' developing brains would essentially shut down. It was, in its own horrible way, a survival mechanism. In the wild, orphaned Korix cubs would have been easy prey. Better to die quickly than to suffer. But these weren't wild cubs. They were on a heated research station with plenty of food and no predators, and they were still dying because their brains couldn't tell the difference. "I'm sorry," Hollis said, and meant it, "but I don't understand why you're telling me this. I'm a human medic, not a Korix specialist. Dr. Prynne would know far more about Dr. Prynne suggested you, Morvak interrupted. Hollis blinked. I'm sorry. She said... He stopped, visibly struggling with the words. She said that humans have a reputation, that your species can form attachments to anything, that you bond indiscriminately, without logic or reason, and that perhaps, he trailed off. You want me to try bonding with your cubs, Hollis said flatly. I want you to try saving them. The silence stretched between them, heavy and strange. Hollis should have said no. She should have pointed out the dozen reasons why this was a terrible idea. That she knew nothing about raising Korek's young, that the cubs might attack her, that even if by some miracle this worked, she would be leaving in 3 months when her rotation ended and the cubs would face abandonment all over again. She should have said no. But Morvak was looking at her with those amber eyes, and behind all that predatory intensity, she could see something painfully familiar. He looked like the parents she had watched during the war, the ones who had carried their children into her field hospital, already knowing it was too late, begging her to try anyway. 1 session, she heard herself say. I'll try 1 session, no promises. Something in Morvak's rigid posture eased just slightly. That is all I ask. He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. Lieutenant, thank you. Don't thank me yet, Hollis muttered. I'll probably just make things worse. But Morvak was already gone. The nursery was located in the Korek section of the base, which meant Hollis had to walk through 3 security checkpoints and endure approximately 14 suspicious glares before she reached it. Word had apparently not yet spread about her mission, and the Korek's guards clearly could not fathom why a human would be wandering their corridors voluntarily. One of them, a young male with patterns shaved into his fur, in what Hollis assumed was some kind of rank designation, actually stepped into her path. Human, he said, in a tone that suggested the word itself was an insult. You are lost. Nope. Hollis held up the access card Morvak had given her. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The guard stared at the card, then at her, then back at the card. His confusion was almost comical. The High Commander authorized this? He did. For what purpose? Hollis considered several responses, most of them sarcastic, before settling on medical consultation. Are you going to let me through, or should I calm him directly? The guard stepped aside so quickly he nearly tripped over his own tail. Hollis continued down the corridor, privately pleased with herself. The nursery door was reinforced, thick enough to stop a plasma round, according to the specifications etched into its frame, and it opened with a soft hiss when she pressed her palm to the scanner. Inside, the air was warm and humid, a stark contrast to the rest of the base. Soft bioluminescent panels provided a gentle amber glow that mimicked, she assumed, the light of the Korek's homeworld. And in the center of the room, huddled together in a nest of heated blankets, were 3 small shapes. Hollis had seen images of Korek's cubs before, but images didn't do them justice. They were, in a word, adorable, if you ignored the claws and the teeth, and the fact that even at this size, they could probably take off a finger without trying. They looked like someone had crossed a wolf pup with a panther cub, and then dialed everything up to 11. Big paws, fuzzy ears, eyes that hadn't yet developed their full glow, but still held that distinctive amber gleam. 2 of them, the larger ones, immediately bristled when they saw her. Their tiny fur stood on end, and they let out hisses that were probably meant to be threatening, but mostly sounded like angry tea kettles. The 3rd one, the smallest, just stared. Hey, Hollis said softly, crouching down to make herself smaller. I know. I'm weird. I smell wrong. I look wrong. Everything about this is wrong. I get it. The two larger cubs, Brock and Orith, according to the data Dr. Prynne had sent her, continued hissing. But the small one, Luma, tilted her head. Then she stood up. Her legs wobbled. She was clearly weak, probably from days of refusing food, and each step looked like it cost her enormous effort. But she kept coming, one unsteady paw after another, until she reached the edge of the nest. And then she sniffed Hollis's outstretched hand. Her nose was cold and wet, and Hollis held perfectly still, barely breathing, as the cub investigated this strange new creature. Luma sniffed her palm, her wrist, the cuff of her uniform sleeve. Her tiny ears twitched with each new scent. Then she bit down. Hard. Hollis hissed through her teeth as tiny fangs broke skin. Blood welled up around Luma's mouth and the cub growled, a ridiculous, squeaky sound from such a small creature. Brock and Orith went silent, watching. Hollis didn't pull away. "Yeah," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the pain. "That's fair. You're angry. You're scared. Everything was taken from you, and you don't understand why. I know that feeling, little one. Trust me." Luma's jaws loosened slightly, but she didn't let go. Her amber eyes stared up at Hollis with an intensity that seemed far too old for a creature this young. "I'm not her," Hollis continued. "I know I'm not. I can't replace what you lost. Nobody can. But I'm here, and I'm not leaving. And if you want to bite me, well, I've had worse." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Luma released Hollis's hand. She stared at the blood on her muzzle, then back at the human who hadn't flinched, hadn't screamed, hadn't pulled away. And she purred. The sound was so unexpected that Hollis actually startled. It was a deep, rumbling vibration that seemed far too big to come from such a small body, a sound that, according to Dr. Prynne's files, Koryx cubs only made when they felt safe, when they felt bonded. Luma wobbled forward and pressed her entire body against Hollis's knee, still purring, and Hollis felt something crack open in her chest that she had thought was sealed shut years ago. "Oh no," she whispered, looking down at the tiny predator currently trying to merge with her leg. "Oh no, no, no." Brock and Orith watched from the nest, their hissing replaced by what Hollis could only describe as bewildered silence. Behind her, the nursery door hissed open, and Dr. Prynne's voice carried across the room, tinged with disbelief. "By the first hunt, she's purring." Hollis didn't turn around. She couldn't look away from Luma, from those amber eyes, and that ridiculous tiny face still smeared with her blood. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm in trouble." Dr. Prynne moved to stand beside her, all 8 feet of Koryx medical officer looming over the scene with an expression of profound, scientific interest. "That sound," she said. "Those cubs have not made that sound since their mother died. We thought they might have forgotten how." Luma purred louder, as if to prove a point. Hollis looked down at her bleeding hand, then at the cub attached to her leg, then at the 2 other cubs who were now watching her with something that might have been curiosity rather than hostility. She thought about her rotation ending in 3 months. She thought about the word temporary. She thought about all the reasons this was a terrible idea. And then she sighed, reached down with her uninjured hand, and gently scratched behind Luma's ear. "1 session," she muttered to herself. "I said 1 session." Luma's purr rattled her entire tiny body. Yeah, she was definitely in trouble. The thing about saying just 1 session is that the universe has a terrible sense of humor. Hollis learned this over the following 3 days, as her single trial visit somehow multiplied into morning feedings, afternoon check-ins, and evening routines that she definitely hadn't agreed to but couldn't seem to stop showing up for. It wasn't her fault, not entirely. The cubs had started eating again. That first day, after Luma's unexpected bonding moment, Hollis had watched Dr. Prynne attempt to feed the cubs their nutrient paste, a thick, meat-based slurry that apparently tasted like heaven to Corrick's young. Brock and Orith had refused, as they had been refusing for days, turning their heads away and retreating to the far corner of the nest. But Luma had looked at Hollis, then at the food, then back at Hollis. And Hollis, operating on some instinct she didn't fully understand, had taken the feeding dish from Dr. Prynne's clawed hands and held it out herself. Luma had eaten. Not much. A few tentative licks at first, then a few proper bites. But she had eaten, and that was more than she had done in nearly 2 weeks. By the end of that first session, Brock had crept close enough to steal a mouthful from the dish, while Hollis wasn't looking. He had retreated immediately afterward, hissing at her like she had personally offended his ancestors. But he had eaten. Orith had held out until the next morning. "You have a gift," Dr. Prynne had told her, with the tone of someone observing a fascinating and slightly disturbing scientific phenomenon. Or, perhaps, a curse. With humans, it is difficult to tell the difference. "Thanks," Hollis had replied dryly. "That's very reassuring." But she kept coming back. By day 3, she had learned their personalities. Brock was the oldest and largest, and he made absolutely certain everyone knew it. He prowled the edges of the nursery like a tiny general surveying his territory, and he greeted Hollis's arrival each morning with a warning growl that had become almost ritualistic. He didn't trust her. He might never trust her. But he had stopped actively trying to bite her, which Hollis counted as progress. He was also, she had noticed, deeply protective of his siblings. When Orith had stumbled during a clumsy attempt at pouncing practice, Brock had been at his side in an instant, checking him over with careful sniffs before resuming his suspicious patrol. When Luma had a coughing fit from eating too fast, Brock had positioned himself between her and Hollis, as if the human might somehow be responsible. He was a good brother. Angry and scared, and probably traumatized, but good. Orith was the middle child in every sense of the word. He watched everything with wide, curious eyes, always observing, always calculating. He was the first to investigate new objects that Hollis brought into the nursery. A ball, a length of rope, a crinkly piece of packing material that had accidentally fallen out of her pocket. He would circle each item carefully, sniffing from every angle, before either pouncing on it or dismissing it with aristocratic disdain. He was also the most skittish. Loud noises made him bolt for the nest. Sudden movements sent him scrambling behind Brock. He wanted to be brave. Hollis could see it in the way he would creep forward, ears perked, trembling with the effort of overcoming his fear. But bravery was hard when you were 8 weeks old and the world had already proven itself cruel. And then there was Luma. Luma was a problem. Specifically, Luma was a problem because she had decided that Hollis belonged to her, and no amount of logic or reason was going to convince her otherwise. She followed Hollis everywhere she was allowed to go. When Hollis sat down, Luma immediately climbed into her lap, regardless of what Hollis was trying to do at the time. When Hollis stood up, Luma wrapped herself around her ankle like a furry shackle and refused to let go. "You have to stay here," Hollis told her on the second day, trying to extract herself from the nursery for her actual medical duties. "I have a job, responsibilities, people who need their injuries treated." Luma had responded by tightening her grip and making a sound that could only be described as a whine. "That's not going to work on me," Hollis said firmly. It worked on her. She was 20 minutes late to her shift, and when she finally arrived at the medical bay, she had tiny claw marks on her boots and a look on her face that made her assistant, a young human named Tomek, very wisely decide not to ask questions. The other Korax on base had started to notice. At first, it was just glances, quick, sideways looks, as Hollis walked through the corridors toward the nursery. Then it became murmurs, conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. She caught fragments sometimes. The human, the cubs, unnatural. She tried not to let it bother her. She was used to being the subject of gossip. During the war, she had been known as the one who treats monsters, whispered about by her own side with a mixture of confusion and contempt. This was just more of the same. But then she noticed that some of the looks weren't hostile. One evening, as she was leaving the nursery after putting the cubs down for their evening nap, she passed a female Korax in the corridor, an older one, with silver threaded through her dark fur and the bearing of someone who had seen many years of hard service. The female stopped, looked at Hollis, and inclined her head in a gesture that Hollis had learned to recognize as respect. "Packtender," the female said quietly. And then she was gone, disappeared around a corner before Hollis could respond. Packtender. Hollis had looked up the term later, digging through the cultural database with a growing sense of unease. It was an old word, rarely used in modern Korax society. It referred to someone who cared for cubs that were not their own, a role that had once been common in Korax packs, but had fallen out of practice as their civilization became more individualistic. It was, according to the database, a position of significant honor. Hollis had stared at the screen for a long time after reading that. She wasn't a packtender. She was a temporary solution, a biological curiosity. She was here because human brains were weird and apparently couldn't help forming attachments to things, not because she had any real claim to these cubs or their family. She needed to start pulling back, for everyone's sake. The decision made sense. It was logical, responsible, and completely correct. The cubs needed to bond with Korax caretakers who would be present for their entire lives, not with a human who would be shipping out in less than 3 months. Every day that Hollis spent with them was another day they weren't forming proper connections with their own kind. She had to pull back. So she did. On day 4, she reduced her visits to twice daily instead of 3 times. She kept her interactions brief and professional. Feeding, health checks, basic socialization, nothing more. She stopped bringing toys. She stopped letting Luma climb into her lap. The cubs noticed immediately. Brack's warning growls became longer, more sustained. Orith stopped approaching her entirely, retreating to the nest whenever she entered and watching her with those big, wounded eyes. And Luma stopped purring. She still followed Hollis, still pressed against her leg, still tried to climb into her lap, despite being gently rebuffed. But that deep, rumbling vibration that had been almost constant since their first meeting had gone silent. Dr. Prynne noticed too. "The small one is regressing," she told Hollis on the evening of day 4, her tone carefully neutral in a way that somehow conveyed deep disapproval. "She ate less today. Her activity levels are declining." "She needs to bond with Korax caretakers," Hollis said, not meeting the doctor's eyes. "I'm leaving in 3 months. It's better if I—" "Better for whom?" The question hung in the air between them. Hollis didn't have an answer. That night, she returned to her quarters and sat on her bunk, staring at the wall. Her room was small, Standard human officer accommodations, barely enough space for a bed, a desk, and a narrow closet. The only personal touch was the pillow she had brought from home. It was old, lumpy. The fabric had been washed so many times it was practically transparent in places, and one corner was held together with medical tape from a repair job she had done during her second deployment. It was, by any objective measure, a terrible pillow. But it had been with her through basic training, through the war, through field hospitals and evac ships, and every single terrible moment of the past 8 years. It smelled like her, like antiseptic and recycled air, and something indefinably human. And on the worst nights, when the memories got too loud, it was the only thing that helped her sleep. She looked at the pillow. She thought about Luma, alone in the nursery, not purring. "This is a bad idea," she said out loud, to no one. Then she grabbed the pillow and headed back to the Corex section of the base. The nursery was dim when she arrived, the bioluminescent panels dialed down to their nighttime setting. The cubs were in their nest, huddled together but not sleeping. She could see the glint of their eyes in the low light. 3 pairs of amber watching her enter. "I brought something," Hollis said quietly, holding up the pillow. "I thought maybe... I don't know. It smells like me. Maybe it'll help when I'm not here." She placed the pillow at the edge of the nest, not too close, just within reach if any of them wanted to investigate. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Luma moved. She crept forward, belly low to the ground, ears flat against her skull. She reached the pillow and sniffed it carefully, thoroughly, covering every inch of fabric with her cold little nose. And then she grabbed it with her teeth and dragged it into the nest. Brock and Orith immediately crowded around, sniffing the strange new object with intense curiosity. There was a brief scuffle, Brock trying to claim it, Orith attempting to investigate the corner, Luma defending her prize with squeaky growls, before they reached some kind of agreement. They arranged themselves around the pillow, pressing against it from all sides. Luma claimed the center, burying her face in the fabric. Brock curled around one end, his paws draped possessively over the edge. Orith tucked himself against the other side, his nervous trembling slowly subsiding. And then, so quietly that Hollis almost missed it, Luma started to purr again. Hollis watched them for a long time. These 3 small predators who had somehow claimed a piece of her without permission. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'm sorry. I won't pull back. I'll figure something out." Luma purred louder. Hollis stayed until they fell asleep, all 3 of them wrapped around her terrible old pillow like it was the most precious thing in the universe. Then she crept out, closed the door softly behind her, and absolutely did not acknowledge the tightness in her throat or the burning in her eyes. She was a combat medic. She had survived a war. She was not going to cry over 3 fuzzy little monsters and a lumpy pillow. She wasn't. The heist happened at approximately 0300 hours on day 6. Hollis was asleep in her quarters, dreaming about something mundane, paperwork, probably, or maybe inventory reports, when her comm unit buzzed with an urgent alert from base security. "Lieutenant Hollis," said the voice on the other end, sounding deeply confused. "This is Sergeant Yennick in the monitoring station. We have a situation." Hollis sat up, instantly awake. Combat medic instincts died hard. "What kind of situation? Injuries? Breach?" "No, ma'am, it's..." The sergeant paused. "It's your pillow, ma'am." Hollis blinked at the comm unit. "I'm sorry?" "Your pillow. The one you left in the Corex nursery. It's moving." "Moving?" "Through the base, ma'am. On its own. Except not on its own, because there are 3 small Corax cubs attached to it, and they appear to be dragging it somewhere. Hollis was already pulling on her boots. The security footage, which she reviewed on her way to intercept the cubs, was remarkable. It showed the nursery door opening at 0247. Somehow, though Hollis couldn't figure out how, since it required a palm scan, and none of the cubs should have been able to reach the panel. Later investigation would reveal that Orith had climbed onto Brack's back, who had climbed onto a stack of storage containers that absolutely should not have been stacked that way, and together they had managed to press the emergency release with their combined weight. The cubs were problem solvers. This was not reassuring. Once in the corridor, they had located the pillow, which Hollis had moved to a shelf near the door, thinking it would be convenient for her next visit, and immediately set about relocating it. The footage showed their strategy with almost comedic clarity. Brack took point, his tiny jaws clamped around one corner of the pillow, pulling with all his strength. The pillow was nearly as big as he was, which meant progress was slow, and frequently interrupted by the need to readjust his grip. Orith worked from behind, pushing with his head and occasionally his entire body when the pillow got stuck on something. He was clearly the tactician of the operation, pausing at intersections to look both ways before directing the group forward. And Luma? Luma was riding on top of the pillow like a tiny queen surveying her kingdom. She wasn't helping at all. She was just sitting there, looking immensely pleased with herself, occasionally chirping what Hollis could only assume were words of encouragement to her laboring brothers. They had made it through 2 corridors, around 4 corners, and past 6 different security cameras before anyone had thought to alert Hollis. "Should we stop them?" Sergeant Yennick asked over the comm. "They're technically in a restricted area." Hollis watched the footage of 3 cubs working in perfect coordination to steal her pillow, and something in her chest did a complicated thing she refused to examine. "No," she said. "I'll handle it. Just keep tracking them." "Yes, ma'am." "For what it's worth, ma'am." The sergeant's voice took on an amused quality. "This is the most entertaining thing that's happened on this base in 6 months." Hollis didn't dignify that with a response. She caught up with them 2 corridors away from her quarters. They had stopped to rest, or rather, Brack and Orith had stopped to rest, while Luma continued to sit on the pillow looking regal. Brack was panting, his small tongue hanging out, and even stoic little Orith looked exhausted. But when they saw Hollis approaching, none of them ran. Brack rose to his feet and positioned himself between the pillow and the human, a growl rumbling in his throat. It wasn't a threatening growl, Hollis realized. It was defensive, protective. He wasn't trying to scare her away. He was guarding his prize. "Hey," Hollis said softly, crouching down to their level. "I'm not going to take it. I just want to know what you're doing." Luma chirped and hopped off the pillow, trotting over to Hollis with the confidence of a creature who had absolutely no doubt of her welcome. She butted her head against Hollis's knee, then turned and looked meaningfully at the pillow, then back at Hollis. The message was clear. "You were bringing it to me," Hollis said slowly. "You figured out where my quarters are, broke out of the nursery, and dragged this pillow halfway across the base, because you wanted to sleep near me." Luma purred. Brack's growl faded into something that might have been agreement. Orith crept forward and gently pressed his nose against Hollis's hand, the first voluntary contact he had initiated since she started pulling back. Hollis looked at these 3 small creatures who had orchestrated an elaborate heist, rather than spend another night without her, and she felt the last of her resistance crumble into dust. "Okay," she said, her voice rough. "Okay, come on. My quarters are this way." She picked up the pillow, which was now covered in cub fur, and smelled distinctly of Coryx, and tucked it under one arm. Then, with considerable difficulty and zero cooperation from Brock, she gathered all 3 cubs against her chest and carried them the rest of the way. Her quarters were not designed for 4 occupants. This did not matter to the cubs at all. Hollis put the pillow on her bunk, and within seconds, all 3 of them had arranged themselves around it. Luma claimed her spot in the center. Brock curled at the foot of the bed, positioning himself between the door and his siblings. Orith squeezed into the narrow space between the pillow and the wall, finally relaxing into something like peace. They were asleep within minutes. Hollis stood in her tiny room, looking at her bunk now entirely occupied by alien predator cubs and one very rumpled pillow, and tried to figure out where exactly she was supposed to sleep. The floor, apparently. She grabbed her spare blanket, folded it into a makeshift pad, and settled down beside the bunk. It wasn't comfortable. Her back was going to hate her in the morning. But when she turned her head, she could see Luma's small face peaceful in sleep, and Brock's ears twitching as he dreamed, and Orith's paws curled tight against the pillow like he was holding on to something precious. She closed her eyes and slept better than she had in months. The next morning, High Commander Morvak arrived at her door. Hollis had been expecting anger, shouting, possibly threats. The cubs had escaped from a secure nursery, wandered through restricted corridors, and spent the night in human quarters. By any reasonable measure, this was a security incident. But when the door opened and Morvak saw the scene inside, Hollis sitting on the floor with her back against the bunk, 3 cubs still asleep on her pillow, Luma's tail draped over the edge and brushing against Hollis's shoulder, he went very still. "They chose," he said quietly. Hollis looked up at him. "I tried to pull back. I thought it would be better for them if I—" "They chose," Morvak repeated. "In Coryx culture, when cubs are old enough to leave the nest on their own, their first journey is significant. It shows where their hearts lead them, where they feel safe." He paused. "My cubs left the safety of their nursery and crossed hostile territory to find you." "It wasn't exactly hostile territory. The corridors are climate-controlled and—" "They did not know that." Morvak's amber eyes met hers. "They only knew that you were somewhere in this base, and they needed to reach you. They worked together. They planned. They risked everything." On the bunk, Luma stirred, lifted her head, and chirped at Morvak before settling back against the pillow. "She recognizes me," Morvak said, and there was something complicated in his voice. "But she did not come to me. She came to you." Hollis didn't know what to say to that. Morvak stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching his cubs sleep peacefully for the first time since their mother died. Then he spoke, and his words changed everything. "The council will need to be informed. There are traditions, protocols. This is not a simple matter." He paused. "But the cubs have chosen, and I will not take that from them." He turned to leave. "Commander," Hollis called after him. "What happens now?" Morvak looked back at her, and for just a moment she thought she saw something like hope in his ancient predator eyes. "Now," he said, "we see if the council agrees that humans can be pack." The council did not agree easily. For 3 days they debated. They argued. They invoked traditions stretching back thousands of years and questioned whether any of those traditions had ever anticipated something this absurd: a human raising Coryx cubs, the children of a high commander, no less. It was unprecedented. It was potentially scandalous. It was, according to one particularly elderly council member, an insult to everything our ancestors built. Morvak defended Hollis with a ferocity that surprised everyone, including himself. But even he could not simply override the council's concerns. So they proposed a test. The cubs would be placed in a traditional hunting scenario, a rite of passage for Coryx young. If they could still hunt, still kill, still demonstrate the predatory instincts that defined their species, then perhaps this human attachment had not ruined them. Hollis was not permitted to watch. She spent that hour in the medical bay, reorganizing supplies she had already organized twice, trying not to think about 3 small cubs alone in an arena designed to test their killer instincts. They were so young, so small. What if they failed? What if the council decided they were broken, contaminated by human softness? What if she had destroyed them by loving them? The comm unit buzzed. "Lieutenant Hollis," it was Morvak's voice, "report to the council chamber." She went. She had never walked so slowly in her life. The chamber was silent when she entered. Dozens of Coryx faces watched her approach, their expressions unreadable. Morvak stood at the center, and beside him, 3 cubs, looking extremely pleased with themselves. They did not hunt as Coryx cubs traditionally hunt, Morvak said, and Hollis's heart dropped. They did not rush in. They did not rely on individual strength. He paused. They coordinated. Brock drove the prey into a corner. Orith flanked it. And Luma. Something shifted in his voice. Pride, Hollis realized. That was pride. Luma dropped from a ledge no one believed she could climb and delivered the killing strike, the council murmured. They learned pack tactics, Morvak continued. They learned to work together, to trust each other, to combine their strengths. They learned this from watching the human and her medical team. He turned to face the council. My cubs have not lost their predator instincts. They have gained something more. The vote was not unanimous, but it was enough. That evening, Hollis returned to her quarters to find 3 cubs already waiting on her bunk, arranged around a pillow that now belonged to all of them. Morvak had given her a title. Pack Mother of Borrowed Blood, he had called it. She had tried to refuse. She was not a mother. She was barely qualified to keep herself alive. But Luma had climbed onto her shoulder, pressed a cold nose against her cheek, and purred so loudly the sound echoed off the walls. And Hollis had understood, finally, that some choices are not made with logic. Some choices are made with the heart. She climbed into bed, let 3 small predators arrange themselves around her, and smiled. Yeah, she whispered. Okay, I guess this is happening. Luma purred in agreement. And somewhere across the galaxy, the legend grew. Give a human something small and vulnerable, and they will burn down the universe to protect it. The Coryx were apex predators. But that night, 3 of their cubs fell asleep on a lumpy pillow, guarded by a human who had never asked for this. And somehow, that was the most dangerous thing in the galaxy.